Seeing none, Chief Financial Officer's report. Tim?
We finished a quarter of the year. Our revenue for the month of September was $546,000. So our total revenue, operating revenue for the first 3 months of the year are $8,882,000. That was 41% of budget. Obviously, the majority of that is real estate taxes that were collected. There was a couple of questions on the revenue items on page 20. There was a question on account 1940, which is the last account on that page. We have revenue at $31,000. There's nothing budgeted on that line. If you look above that at account 1612, that's where we originally budgeted the revenue that we received from districts 94 and 95. We'll switch that budget number. This was something that the auditors suggested, that instead of using 1612, we use account 1940. So next month you'll see that budget number 315,000 down on account 1940.
Don't we have to approve change in a budget line if it's over a certain amount?
On a line item
Yeah.
within,
I thought you had to approve a transfer to offset a funds accounting or a loan, interfund loan.
Well, I think you should check. I think
Yeah.
We'll check on that.
All right. all right, check on
Go back to your report, Tim. Why don't you go to that before you get into the other questions?
Pardon?
Want to go
Sorry.
back to your report and then go into the questions, so we're not jumping back and forth?
that. Okay. The expenditures for the month of September, operating expenditures, $1,639,000. The total operating expenditures for the first 3 months were 20% of budget. Most of the funds are at about 25%. The 20% is reflective of the fact that we really haven't transferred much money out of working cash, which is reflected in the operating fund. On a quarterly review, I think similar to last year, as we set the budget up in June, and as we go through July and August and into September when you approve it, we make changes as we become aware of things. So at this point in the year, after the first quarter, there really isn't much in terms of changes or anything significant that I see in terms of where we're budgeted. The only 2 items where we're going to see something significant, general state aid will probably come in at about $762,000. We had budgeted it at $738,000. And I just found out today that our Title I allocation increased from $111,000 to $152,000. That's, the federal government does that. They give you an initial allocation, and then later they give you a revised allocation. So we went up by $43,000, but we'll also have expenditures going up by $43,000 because we have to put in new expenditures for that. We'll come back to the internal control audit. There was a question there. On the building rentals, I've got a chart in Board Book that runs through October 8th. Our total income of $24,000 was 29% of budget, and about half of that comes from revenue from the field house, and a third of it comes from rental at the pool at this time of the year. Also included in your packet was the audit for the Township Treasurer's Office. Their board approved that audit last Tuesday, and it was sent out to you last week. And in terms of the other questions, there were on page 21, which is another revenue item, account 4625, Federal Special Ed Idea Room and Board. There's no budget there. We've received so far this year $36,000. That money was budgeted last year, should have come in last year, but because it goes through the state, the payment gets delayed, and even though it was part of fiscal 14, it didn't get paid until this first quarter of fiscal 15. There was also a question on page 32 on non-certified salaries. It's account 1130, There's a few questions here on salaries and stipends, and this is goes back to the idea that the budget is an accrual and the financials are a cash basis. So when we're budgeting some of our salary and our stipend expenditures for fiscal 14 that didn't get paid until July of of this year, which is now in fiscal 15, we're ending up with expenditure items that don't necessarily tie into the budget amounts.
Say that again, you say this, our budget's on accrual on our,
So it's similar to the revenue where we budgeted last year for that federal room and board. We thought we were gonna get the money last year, but we didn't get it until this year. So our
Right.
budget last year shows an amount, and we have no revenue this year. We have no budget, but we have the revenue. Similarly, on the
But if a budget-
expenditures, if you remember when we finished the year out, we talked about how the salaries that were budgeted for last year, part of those were being paid in July.
right.
Okay, because now we had changed over to paying people over a 12-month period, starting in August, running through July. So we came in on a cash basis considerably under budget because those salaries were not paid in June.
But the concept of, and you and I maybe will never agree on this, that you say we budget on an accrual. We do the finance, if we budget on an accrual, use an example, we expect to get something last year and we didn't, we expected to get it this year. If you're doing an accrual basis, wouldn't you include it in the budget for this year? Isn't that what an
Well,
accrual
no,
does?
I think if you look at those revenue items, we budgeted that amount last year. I don't think we would budget it again this year. I mean, I don't think you do that.
So we budgeted last year and didn't get it.
Mhm.
Just thought we were gonna get it this year, but didn't budget it.
Correct.
Isn't that the definition of a cash budgeting? You did it by when you thought the cash was going to come in?
Well, but if I'm budgeting items that we're gonna get from the state, I don't necessarily know when we're gonna get paid. Some of those could get paid during the fiscal year and be paid out by the end of June. You know, other times, they're not gonna pay that money out till sometime in July or August, or in this case, September on this one account. You know, I don't know what that is. I don't see how you could budget on a cash basis when you're not sure when that money's gonna come in. So you're budgeting based on what you think your revenue should be for the year, what your expenditure should be for the year. But that's not always gonna be the case.
Thank you.
Okay. And there was one question with regard to the internal control audit. One of the recommendations that they made was not to commingle board revenue with student activity fund revenue. And my comment to that was that considering the amount of money that we collect, especially during registration, that it's not practical to segregate that money into, and separate it so that we're making separate deposits into student activity account and board accounts. If you think about registration where, you know, we have 3 or 4 people up there collecting money, they're collecting $60,000, $70,000 in one day. Parents are coming in with one check that they want to pay all their fees. It's not practical to be able to say we have to take that money and segregate it when we make the deposits. That's why we take that money, we deposit it into the board accounts, and then later on, we pull the money out and put it into the activity accounts.
So
But
if
it's
a
just
parent,
like
if a
during-
parent, so the example, when you and I discussed this, was the parent that comes into registration based on what the internal controls audit said, not putting them in the same funds. In order for that to work, a parent would need to come in and instead of, when they get to the end of the line, writing one check, they would need to write 2 or 3 checks.
Right.
One
Or
for.
they'd have to have cash that would be able to separate the cash so that here's the cash for this.
So
here's
you'd have to
cash
give
for
the
that.
credit card twice if you were paying by charge, one for school fees, then one for athletic and activity fees.
And during the month of September, we send out statements to people, and during passing periods, the kids are lined up to make payments, and they come in with a check, say, here, this pays my fees. You'd have to tell them they can't use one check to pay their fees, they'd have to come back with 2 checks. There's just there are times during the year when kids are lined up to pay fees. When we get closer to prom and they can't go to prom unless they pay their fees, they're literally lined up down the hall to come into the business office and pay their fees. You know, they're coming in with one check, or just cash. It's not a practical thing. I think it would slow down the whole process, especially registration.
Tim, you had a question on that, so I just wanted to make sure that was.
Well, I mean, the auditor made his strongest recommendation on that when he said it's imperative
Right.
that this be done. He didn't say we think it's a good idea, you know, maybe we should consider it. Imperative is a pretty strong word to use, so we're basically just saying, we don't care if you thought it was imperative, we're not going to do it that way.
Yeah, I'm saying I disagree with them that it's imperative. I
Okay.
think it's ideal, but it's not practical.
Okay.
Any other questions for Tim?
That was all.